for inviting me to this workshop. These are very, very brief sessions. All the speakers are feeling frustrated. There is a long paper behind this, which I'm very happy to email anyone who's interested, and also the slides. I think if I'm going to make one major point in my talk, it is really the point that Michael Keith was making about the dialogue of the deaf when he opened this conference yesterday. People from different disciplines in thinking about the urban talk past each other. I'm a sociologist, and I'm going to be quite rude about it. Well, in the paper, I'm quite rude about epidemiologists, I'm afraid. We're trying to understand what's going on in the city. And my main interest is in a concept called mechanism. It's not a very new concept. It sounds rather 19th century. How can we find concepts and conceptual structures which can operate in different disciplines? I am particularly, one of my annoyances is the way that the social environment, social context is misunderstood by people from other disciplines, architecture, biology particularly, who absolutely do not understand what social means and articulate it in ways which are ludicrous from the point of view of sociology and yet are constantly reproduced. And I'll say a bit about that. So these thoughts come out of another one of these Newton Fund projects. Thank you very much for the money. We're looking at migrant workers and their mental health in Shanghai. Is it the up and down buttons? Yeah. Okay, got it. So this is what we were looking at, the state of the mental health of migrant workers in Shanghai, on the presumption that they would be living stressful lives and their mental health would be suffering. The first point I want to make is, why mental health is it important? And here this is a technical discussion between us, but I'm using years lost to disability rather than disability adjusted life years. If you use years lost to disability, sorry, the next slide. This is just to support your first point, that non-communicable diseases are the diseases of the future, not communicable diseases. But most of our efforts still go, and most of our imagery and the shock tactics go towards communicable diseases. Even low-income countries, by 2030, most of their years lost to this, the burden, as you call it, will be in non-communicable diseases. If you look at years lost to disability, this little term here, actually mental illness is the biggest disease burden in the world. It's much bigger than heart disease and cancer. It gets almost no research money comparable with those big diseases. That's the reason we're looking at mental health. And those of you who don't work in health and don't know about this, you need to know it's non-communicable diseases and it's mental health which are bad for people. It's not necessarily HIV. My wife works in HIV or malaria, and it's not necessarily physical diseases which are bad for people. If we're thinking about future-proofing the city, as Monique talked about, we have to think about health in these sorts of terms. Okay, Shanghai. That's a picture. Some of you'll have seen this before if you were in Brazil in the Rio seminar. This is our area of fieldwork in Shanghai. Between choosing the area for fieldwork and actually starting to look at migrant workers living here, they knocked much of the place down suddenly within about 2 months. That's the kind of activity that goes on, not just in Shanghai, it goes on in Moscow, and it goes on in other parts of the world. Massive clearance of informal livelihoods. And we were interested to see what sort of stresses this produces for people in our study. I'm going to have to start rushing through. That's what happened in Shanghai in the last 20 years. A lot of change, growth of economic forces, you know about this, massive in-migration. Consequences, that it's been heavily government regulated, that protests against changing working conditions and living conditions in Shanghai are very heavily suppressed, even more so in the last couple of years since President Xi has taken power. Dissent is not allowed, essentially. And interestingly, the official view of dissent is that it's a form of mental illness. I find this particularly ludicrous as an idea, but that if you don't agree with the system, you must be suffering from some sort of mental illness. So actually, government officials are very interested in mental health policy, and in fact, a new mental health law, national law, was passed in 2015 in China, which the local regulations are being written now. One of the things we want to do is to try and influence so that they don't equate dissent with mental illness. Okay, one of the things, this is a curious slide. The Good City reminded me of a book by a guy called Ray Parle, the late Ray Parle, he's gone now. I had an office next to him for 20 years at the University of Kent, and he wrote a book in 1970 called Whose City, which I think is very much was asking the same sorts of questions we're asking now. And I actually, in the paper, and I won't go through it in detail, I looked at some of the main themes of his research and discovered, I had forgotten, but discovered how relevant they were to what we're doing. Do you know what the picture is?
Don Quixote.
Yes, Don Quixote. And what Ray often talked about himself is he spent his life tilting at sociological windmills. He loved to prick pomposity and the big conceptual apparatus. He was very much interested in ordinary people's lives and how they evolved. And just very quickly, his first work was on herbs in Rouen, and that was a study of in the UK. His point from that was that people can be in the city but not of it, and they can be of the city and not in it. And the relationship between people and the cities in which they live is complicated. I'm running through this now. Urban managers versus markets, he pointed out that the political economy turn in the 1970s in social science is not enough. There are lots of small ways in which power is exercised, distributed and operated, which is not really reducible to political economy and markets and the big forces. And he went out of fashion in the 70s when political economy came in, but I think he should come back into fashion. The use of the hukou system to control the 10 million migrants who are unregistered in Shanghai is an example of that. It's not to do with political economy, it's to do with racial prejudice, if you can call it racial, or in-group and out-group prejudice. Migrants are referred to by respectable local Shanghai dwellers as rats. The public health department we're working with, I discovered most standard surveys of health, regular public health surveys, don't include migrants because they don't have addresses so that you can't survey them. So there is, of the 25 million people in Shanghai, 10 million don't turn up in regular public health surveys, so we don't know from those regular sources. That's an extraordinary blindness to who's living in that city. I find that quite extraordinary. Thirdly, he was very interested in informal and formal work, and that's a very important thing for migrant workers. And he said of his book Divisions of Labour, which came out in 1984, which was the relationship between informal and formal work, and he said he described it as my best book. But he said, I made a few rash assumptions in going into that work, and that was that self-provisioning and informal work could take the place of formal work as he saw it in the 1980s. And he was howled down by many other people saying that's just not good enough. But guess what? We now have the gig economy. If he was alive, he would be smiling wryly that actually many, many people in a city like London have to survive with informal work. His final work, which was done in the early part of the 21st century, was on friends and family. And his argument that maybe friends are becoming more important in the world given the decline of other sorts of connections and solidarities. And we certainly found that very important in our work in Shanghai, particularly migrants who carry their families in their heads. Migrant workers who live in Shanghai psychologically are still living, many of them, back in their villages. They may be physically present in the city, they may work in the city, they work for years and years and years at very long hours jobs. Their minds are back in the village, and we've been back to some of those villages and talked to people about that. It's complicated when you think about the urban and who's in it. I've now got about another 20 slides to do in 5 minutes, so I'm just literally going to whiz through. Mechanisms. Mechanisms is a concept I would commend to you. It's being discussed at great length in the philosophy journals now, and I'm usually around this one piece of Nobel Prize-winning research, which was done in the 1950s by Hodgkin and Huxley about the squid, that's the fish, the squid neuron and how it works. The reason it's used is because it raises this question of emergent simplifications and how we understand how one thing leads to another. Now, here are some examples, and this is where I start to criticize epidemiologists, of people who talk about, these are reviews of or studies, epidemiological studies of mental health and the effect of cities on mental health. Cities raise the risk of mental health by 100%. You're twice as likely to become mentally ill if you live in a city. We'll all use this term social, just to give you an example of how ubiquitous this is. And almost none of them, well, I would say none of them really understand what the social is. It's usually measured either by what school you went to, i.e. what exam levels you've got, possibly your income, and nothing else about your social life in the city. And what you discover, or what they discover, is it's all very difficult. Nothing seems to correlate very well. The correlations are tiny. We're not really getting anywhere. We can't penetrate this data. The bigger and bigger and bigger the data sets get, the smaller and smaller the correlations get. And they don't understand this. There's a lot of head scratching and saying, this is all very difficult. And colleagues of mine at King's do this. Not just epidemiologists. Architects do the same sort of thing. I'm just taking this as an example of principles of healthy places, particularly in the city. Lots of social categories in there, very poorly articulated and misunderstood. I blame sociologists for this, not necessarily other colleagues, because we don't work in these areas well enough. The paper then goes on great in the middle bit to look at what kinds of ways we could articulate the mechanisms between urban life, the social aspects of urban life and mental disorder. And I won't go through all of these, you'll be glad to know, other than to say that the fifth one, ethnography, is what we're actually using in Shanghai, because I think the rest of them don't work very well. And I then want to move on quickly to say, I'm just going to finish on one concept called stress. Stress is the candidate concept that everybody loves. They love it in social science, they love it in biology, they love it in psychiatry, and so on. Stress is the connector between urban life and what's happening to us inside. So I wanted to have a bit of a look at stress. Now that's a very slippery, it turns out to be quite a slippery concept. This is the standard model. Environmental stresses, your urban. Major life events, trauma in violence against women and girls, and trauma and abuse when you're young. They all lead to perceived stress, and out of the bottom of this brain drops allostatic load, which is a combined way of measuring stress. If you look at the reviews of allostatic load, and here are two, one from 2009 and one from 2017, it's appallingly badly theorized and measured. In fact, it's almost meaningless. This is by sympathetic people trying to look through systematic reviews at what is the relationship between allostatic load and mental disorder. Particularly, I think, surprising from the 2017 review is the empirical literature on allostatic load is intrinsically flawed and without any strong conceptual basis. 59 different biomarkers are being used. The word stress is used in the biological or the medical literature, and it's used in the social science literature, and it's very, very poorly theorized. We actually don't really know what it means. You might think you know what it means, but actually, empirically, that's not true. So that's stress one, is measuring it through allostatic load. You find in the literature, there's a lot of this is done. Stress is, and people are doing this, they're actually taking people who lived in urban settings and lived in rural settings, and then experimenting on them to see how they react to stress, to see if urban living somehow undermines their ability to deal with it. And there are two examples here. One is where you have to get up and recite a list of things you're supposed to remember in front of severe-looking people in white coats. It's designed to make you feel bad. All right? This is widely used in very, very respectable literature, in the neurosciences literature. You have to believe me on that. It's all in here. Here's another one, very commonly used. You stick your hand in a cold tank of very cold water until it hurts so much you pull your hand out. that's a measure of stress. So they then find out about your life, your urban living, what happened to you as a kid, to see if your ability to keep your hand in the cold water varies. This is seen as a way of measuring stress. Widely, of course, you look, it's not. It's widely used. There are many people writing papers using this kind of thing. It's also, the cold pressor test is actually part of a set of technologies which measure pain. So it seems to me it's much more about measuring pain than it is about stress, but that's, I haven't got time to talk about that. The third way is what's called social neuroscience. So neuroscientists have got onto the idea that the social might well be important. And so if you look at some of the, Chopper is the guy who's written most on this, and he's very interested in loneliness and conviviality. If you look at most of the data, I would say from these reviews, almost all of the data comes from observing mice and rats running around in little cages and separating them and putting them together and seeing how they relate. This kind of data is then used to jump to these sorts of conclusions. This is a 2015 Nature Reviews in Neuroscience. This is mostly animal studies. If stress that is caused by social disputes such as war, physical abuse, or aberrant socio-economic inequalities exacerbates antisocial dispositions in individuals, it may be instrumental in the development of spirals of violence. So you get all this stuff which has nothing to do with our social science, and you suddenly get plonked on the end of it, a conclusion about the nature of society and the urban. These people are listened to by policymakers and politicians because they're respectable. They wear white coats, they publish in very difficult to get into journals with very impressive statistics. They manage their own data environment extremely well. I'm sorry to talk about them as they. And they are presenting views of the social which are not correct in my view, or under-theorized. Two final slides, I think. How long have I got? 1 minute? No minutes. Okay, yes. So firstly, just to say, what do we do about it? Our answer in Shanghai is we do ethnography. We do very close-grained, everyday observation of the daily lived experience of people's lives. I'm using this as an example where it's been successfully used to unpack the social class distribution of reactions to diabetes, which we know is a very well-established relationship between social class and diabetes, as it is with mental health. But it's been interestingly unpacked through ethnography. Ethnography is needed in order to figure out the mechanisms involved. Last slide. These are some of the knowledge gaps, and here I blame my own discipline of sociology of not really, in the contemporary era, taking seriously, asking how do these social factors, what are the mechanisms by which they actually impact people's lives? And talking with natural scientists, using the term mechanisms, but trying to say, yes, but we have to conceptualize these things more carefully. So that when I listened to the keynote this morning, when you were talking about what's happening in Durban, all my instincts were saying, yeah, but what are the mechanisms? That's why I raised the privacy issue, because it's utopian thinking won't work. And I'm not criticizing at all for that, but you have to understand what leads from A to B to C, otherwise you make mistakes. And I don't think we do enough of that at all in between disciplines. Thanks.